What do you think is C.S. Lewis's greatest work of fiction? Can you explain that position? Was Socrates a real person? Just curious if you think of the left as a cult. You left your questions, and now I'm going to go through as many of them as I can. So I'm going to get to answering these questions in a sec, but before I jump in, I have an announcement that I'm really excited about. I've been talking to you for a while about how dismayed I am over big tech, about the way in which these just like complete losers are cracking down on conservative voices, how hard it is for people to feel secure on platforms like Twitter and Facebook and even, Apple Podcasts, which is where you get this show, or where a lot of you do. And so I've been thinking a lot about how I'm going to preserve this community that we have. We've got something really beautiful going on together, and I love doing this show. I love hearing from you about it with your questions and your reactions, right? This has been a great joy to me. And I wanted to take it to the next level. I wanted to find a way to fight back against big tech. And we've together, our team has found an answer, and that's Locals. So Locals is a new platform, and it's kind of the brainchild of my pal, Dave Rubin, who you probably know about. And because Dave's at the helm of it, it is kind of committed to free speech. And it's a really awesome sort of new way to build this community, and for you also to support the show and to hopefully kind of help us keep it going and bring it forward. It's at youngheretics.com/locals. So if you go there right now, you can kind of check it out, and you're going to get a bunch of extra stuff on there in addition to the show itself. So, for example, you can get next week's episode right now already. You can get it in advance if you're a subscriber on Locals. Get it ad-free, which is pretty cool. And then I'm also going to be doing this new thing, the video mailbag. So you can kind of be on the show. You can record yourself, and then instead of tweeting it at me or whatever, you just will be there asking the question, and I'll answer it. And then beyond that, there will just be all kinds of exclusive content that I'll put up there that you can only get there. So I'll do articles, I'll do live streams, Q&As, all this stuff. It's just a way for us to connect more and to build this community out, like I said. So you sort of become a Young Heretics VIP. Just right now, while we're launching it, we're kind of lowering the price of this, so you can get it for just $4.99 a month. So come join us. It's youngheretics.com/locals, and you can become a Young Heretics VIP. And make sure once you get there, leave me a little message on the wall so that I know you're there, and we'll take this thing forward together. A while back, I sort of invited people to leave a 5-star review on iTunes, because that's a really helpful thing for the show. And in exchange, I said, during a certain window, you could hold me hostage to any mailbag question that you wanted. So you guys really delivered. You poured in all sorts of really lovely comments, so thank you for that. And then, you left your questions, and now I'm going to go through as many of them as I can in one episode. And I say that because they're really good, substantive, meaty questions. I want to give them all the time that they require and deserve. And so if I don't get to every last one, please forgive me. One way that I'm going to sort of organize them is I'm going to start with the ones about sort of big ideas. And then if we have time, we'll get to the ones about, well, have you read this book or that book? But we'll start with the kind of the big ones, and I'll organize them in that way just to make sure that I give those ones enough time. Before I start with the first question, I'm going to just bring you a word from our sponsor. I'm so glad to be working with these guys. They're really cool, the Ancient Language Institute, where you can sign up to learn an ancient language and get a grasp on these texts firsthand in a way that you would learn a living language, which is by sort of reading and speaking, not by memorizing these long lists, but by actually engaging with the texts and speaking from day one. They are fantastic. I really believe in their mission, and they can help you get a grasp, especially on, for example, biblical Greek, if you really want to learn that. And so their spring semester is currently in progress. You can't really sign up for that, but what you can do is get private tutorials, which are great because you move at your own pace, and you get a lot of personalized attention. So go to ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics and enter the offer code heretics to get 15% off. That's ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics, and enter HERETICS, just like in the title. ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics, offer code heretics for 15% off. Okay, let's dig in. The very first one, at least the first one that I saw that I can find. If there's an earlier one, let me know, and maybe I'll like tweet out the answer or something. But the first one was Socrates a real person? Yes, yes, he was. It's one of these things where if anybody in the ancient world was real, or if we can trust any of our ancient sources, there was a person named Socrates. He was a philosopher. He made quite a stir. He was put to death. I mean, these basic facts of his life we know to be true. In so far as we know anything to be true about the ancient world, which is by the reliable historical reports of eyewitnesses and people who were there and knew him. Where things get trickier is not did he exist or not, because he did exist. The tricky part is what was he actually like and what did he actually do? And that is hard because Plato himself, who was the student of Socrates. Remember, Socrates kind of doesn't write anything down. In many ways, the forefather of all Western philosophy, although there were many philosophers who preceded him, but he kind of began the movement that we are now still in, of trying to seek out stable truth in a world that seems to have a lot of things that are shifting and in flux. So that's the story, right? Is Socrates goes about in the 5th century BC in barefoot in the agora, wandering about the Greek marketplace and sort of cornering people, speaking especially to the young men, right? The sort of people who are going to grow up to lead the city, and kind of derailing them from their political ambitions by making them wonder whether it's all worth it, what the good is, what's virtuous. And so the story goes, right, that he stands against this sophistic movement, the movement of sophistes, or sophistae is the plural, but the sophistes, one sophistes is a sophist. It basically just means wise teacher, but these were guys who were selling these kind of erudite, flashy doctrines and rhetorical skills. And the story again goes that these people were relativists. They were teaching how to use your smarts to get political power. And Socrates was about how to actually get at the truth. And this was so threatening to the order of the city and to things like the civic religion that we talked about in the Antigone episode. This was so threatening that they had him killed. And Plato learned from him, went on to try to capture in dialogue form what it was to know this man and to have your life changed by him, and how in relationship and friendship he drew out of people wisdom and knowledge that they didn't even know they were missing. And this has been a model for I think about Socrates all the time when I'm having conversations with people or teaching people or doing this podcast, for example, ways to make a relational connection that draws the truth out of people. And from there, of course, Aristotle is Plato's student. And the trick and the problem emerges because Plato is not just trying to get at what Socrates thought and believed. He's also using Socrates and his memories of Socrates as a way of seeking truth further, of carrying Socrates' mission forward. And Socrates therefore becomes kind of a character. And some people say that the later Plato's career goes, the more Socrates sort of becomes a mouthpiece for Plato's own ideas as he's developing them and questioning things that Socrates said and believed. One point on which this is the case is the unity of virtue, right? Are all virtues one, or are there different types of virtue that are distinct from each other? And so it's really almost impossible for us to know which of these details, especially the anecdotes and the stories, which of these are exactly true to life, which of them have been magnified, and which of them are just sort of made up in this fictional way. People have spent, hours and hours, years, decades of their lives, and thousands upon hundreds of thousands of millions of words trying to answer this question. We simply will never know. There's no dispositive evidence that we can use except to read the texts carefully and try to discern the voice of Plato over and against the voice of Socrates. But was he real? Yes, he was real. He did exist. If he hadn't, there would have had to be a vast conspiracy of not only Plato but also Xenophon, who writes at length about him, to pretend that this was a human being who was involved in major political events, like the oligarchic coup, right? Involved in major political events that just never existed. And so similarly to Jesus, it's you can dispute the claims about his divinity if that's what you're wondering about. You can't really dispute that a person named Jesus existed around this time. Yes, he was real. Okay, here's the next one. Hey Spencer, love your show. Awesome, so glad. Quick question. On your Machiavelli episode, you said virtu, this willingness to do whatever is necessary, good or bad, is not governed by the moral law. Can Can you explain that position? Because if virtue is good and not bad, it will be governed by the moral law, because all that is good comes from God, because God is goodness and would never cause or encourage us to sin. Ah, yes. Okay, this is good. I've gotten a couple questions about the Machiavelli episode, in which I was discussing the differences between Greek arete, which is the word that we now translate as virtue, but which really means excellence, the English word virtue, and our English ideas about moral virtue and excellence, and the Italian word virtu, which comes to us through the Latin word virtus, and is a very specific concept in Machiavelli. So let me try and answer what I think this person is getting at, which is, I said essentially that Machiavellian virtu can be displayed in doing acts that we might consider morally ambiguous, that you can show daring and strength and decisiveness in leadership, which has a lot to do with what virtu is in Machiavelli. You can display that even when you're doing something that can be very troublesome and even authoritarian or merciless, right? These things that we also think are bad and morally wrong. To understand this, we have to go back to that first Greek word, which is arete. And remember that I said it means excellence. It means being very good at whatever it is. And initially, that is bigger than just moral excellence. You can have arete in foot racing. If you have arete excellence in foot racing, it's not a moral virtue of yours. It's simply a skill that you have. You're very, very good at running, and you're faster than everybody else. You can have arete in flute playing, in playing the aulos, right, or the double pipes. And that means you're very good at that. That also is not actually a moral excellence. It's a skill, and you can attain it to higher degrees. It all has to do with the purpose. What is the thing that you are doing, and how do you do it well? So what is flute playing? Well, it is, Aristotle would have said, is making a mimesis in sound of certain things, especially emotions. And so if you're good at that, if you construct those mimeses well, then you have excellence, not moral excellence, just arete. The reason why we come to translate this word as virtue is because when Aristotle starts to think about what morality is, what good and bad morality is, he says, well, morality is basically excellence at being human. Human beings are moral beings, and our moral evaluations are evaluations about what it is to be human and whether you're doing well at it. And the ethical virtues, the ethikae aretae, is a subset of the larger category of virtues. So there's all these different kinds of being good at, but the ethikae aretae are these essential ethical virtues having to do, and ethikos it means having to do with the condition of your soul, and Aristotle derives it from ethos, which is another Greek word meaning habit. So it's like the habits, the way that you tend to react to things, the impulses that you train up in yourself. And so the first thing to understand is that our word virtue is actually selecting a very narrow subset of the larger set of things which are called arete, which are excellence, just being good at anything. Always, from the very beginning of that, there is a problem or a complexity about the virtue of courage. Andrea is the Greek word for it. It's one of the cardinal virtues, meaning one of the essential virtues for Aristotle. And it is essentially irrevocably connected to manliness. Male virtue is bound up with courage. And if you don't have courage, courage kind of enables all the other virtues, because if you just give up your virtues when you're afraid, well, then you don't really have them, right? Courage is something that we can see displayed even in the pursuit of bad acts. And it has a certain excellence to it, even when it's deployed wrongly. You can see this worked out in wars where one side is virtuous, but both sides' soldiers are displaying what the Greeks would have called andreia, manly courage. And so there's a complexity here that courage straddles the line between the ethical virtues, specifically moral goods, and the other kinds of goods that are just, they are themselves a form of being good at something. Even though, not all goods are moral goods, right? You're right that all goods come from God, but some goods are morally neutral, and their morality consists in their use. So, for example, flute playing, right, is a good thing. It's a pleasurable thing, but you can use it to seduce people. You can use it for all sorts of nasty things. courage is kind of like that, except that it does have to do with your character. So it straddles this line. A dialogue to read, if you want to pursue this line of inquiry further, is Plato's Laches, in which he kind of disagrees with what I'm saying a little bit. He basically says that courage is only really courage, or he suggests that courage is only really courage if it is used in the service of the moral good. To me, that doesn't quite get at the problem that I'm identifying, which is the problem that comes to us then through the Roman tradition into Machiavelli, and that is that a certain degree of manly daring do, which is wrapped up in virtus, which kind of combines that Andrea with that arete. It's like it is the Latin word from which we get virtue, and yet it combines up both this kind of this morally ambiguous or morally neutral courage alongside the ethical virtues. And Machiavelli picks that up and takes it even a little bit further and just identifies that, as I talked about when we talked about the formation of early Rome, right? There was something essential about manly courage and daring do in Rome that wasn't always used to the ethical good, was sometimes ethically kind of ambiguous or even appalling. And yet, it was essential. It was indispensable. And this is why shows like Breaking Bad, remember when I talked about the Maltese Falcon, right? Shows like Breaking Bad kind of raise this problem too, that we sort of admire Walter White taking his life into his hands, even though he does it in the service of evil. The problem is that there are other kinds of good besides moral goods. And humans, being fallen, can use those goods for evil ends. And then, of course, yes, they do become a form of sin, and therefore they're then not ethical virtues, right? They're not the kind of virtues that we mean when we use the English word virtue now. But you have to understand that Machiavelli's word virtu is not the same as our word virtue, which basically just means those narrow ethical virtues. Virtu it kind of straddles the boundary, just like Andrea does, straddles the boundary between the set of virtues that are ethical and then the set of virtues that are just like being good at a thing, which is necessary but can sometimes be used for evil. This is a very complicated question, and I'm glad that you asked it. I hope that I've clarified it a little bit. It has to do with the different, what you would call the semantic range of the different words. It picks out, and arete is probably the broadest one. It picks out all of these different kinds of excellences. And then these other words like virtu and Andrea and our English word virtue kind of select out different parcels of those virtues, some of which are ethical virtues, they're morally good, and some of which are not. And so this Machiavellian thing is a way of recognizing that manly courage has a use and a worth in the world, even though that worth can be manipulated and used wrongly by ethically sinful humans. Hope that answers the question. Spencer, I just graduated and will soon be going into the ministry as a pastor of a Baptist church. Congratulations, and God bless you. That's fantastic. There's a lot to learn from our history, but the average person isn't very interested in art or history. How do you think pastors can get the average churchgoer to be interested in high art? I like this question because obviously it's a question that I think about like all the time, because in order to make this show, I have to think about how to not be boring. And so I will tell you just what I have learned in that process and also in a whole career to date of thinking about how to convey these ideas to different people and from different walks of life. I mean, I've said before that one of my great joys in reading these 5-star reviews is they come from everywhere, and sometimes from people who are like, I just didn't even know that I cared about this stuff, you know? And so the first piece of advice, I guess, that I would give you is that, you know, of course it's true that like high art and great culture have a value all their own. But you don't necessarily get to just dictate that to people. You have to hit them where they live. You have to show people why it is that the great excellences of high art have something to say to them in their lives. And so when I'm coming to the show, I'm always thinking, well, I really love this poem. It's very beautiful. But that's not really something that actually like needs to be said on a podcast. Like what needs to be said on a podcast is like, okay, so you've got a mortgage to pay, right? You person, and it's funny because I look into this camera, right? And I talk into this microphone, but I'm really I'm talking through that and through those cameras and this microphone to this person on the other side who's got a mortgage to pay, he's got kids, he's worried about the state of the world, right? She's wondering how she's going to get breakfast on the table, all this stuff, and all of these works, if they are worth their salt, if they're worth the hype, right? There's something in them that actually will change the way that person feels about and thinks about getting up in the morning and doing those things. This is, of course, also the job of a pastor, right? To take these big, beautiful, in some cases quite abstract theological truths about God's mercy, and to make them immediate for this person. So if you go back and listen to the episode about Nicomachean ethics, it's called What Are You For? This, I think, is maybe the closest I've come to kind of doing this. And sermons, I think, are really good when they do this too. And of course, this is what the Incarnation is all about, right? It's about God who is just like infinite and beautiful and perfect, but like impossible for us to grasp in our kind of like shambolic way. He comes down, he distills himself into the thing that meets you right in the eyes. And so if you're inviting people into that wonderful tradition and to enrich their lives this way, I think you need to show them how it is that it actually does enrich their lives to be doing this at all. It's a good question, and it takes a certain degree of practice and training, and I'm sure that you yourself have had much training in it. But let me know how it goes, because I'm really excited that you're kind of embarking on this journey. Okay, before I answer the next question, I'm going to pause and bring you a message from our other sponsor, Expressvpn. I am really glad that Expressvpn is sponsoring us, because it's actually something really important right now that we be working around and finding ways to fight against big tech. They are absolutely censoring conservatives online right now. I felt the heat of it. I've been like bleeding followers for no reason. People are unfollowed from me, and they're thinking about how to stop us from talking to each other. ExpressVPN is one of the great ways that you can protect yourself against this malign influence. Go to expressvpn.com/heretics. If you go there, you get 3 extra months free on a 1-year package. That's expressvpn.com/heretics, HERETICS. Okay, on to the next question. This one I love this. This one is entitled A Man with a Chest. And I hope that is not just referring to my bench press PR. It is also referring to the C.S. Lewis Men Without Chests section, in which he's saying that I'm engaging intellectually, but also thumatically, energetically, and manfully. So this is wonderful. Here's a question that he has. My question is a long shot, but I am dying to know, how would you explain the golden ratio as it relates to harmonic proportion in a theological sense? It exists in music and architecture. It must exist in literary composition. Let me explain for a second what this person is asking about, because it's really interesting. It's one of these wonderful sort of mysteries of the world that encompasses mathematics and art and everything. In math, 2 quantities are in the golden ratio if their ratio is the same as the ratio of their sum to the larger of the 2 quantities. So you have 2 numbers, right? And you divide one by the other. And if that ratio is the same as the ratio you get if you add the 2 numbers up and you divide the larger number by that sum, right? This is expressed by the Greek letter phi or phi, which is the sort of the pH letter. And the thing about this ratio is that quantities which are in this relationship have all of these strange aesthetic qualities. They're beautiful. They're kind of they've been used in architecture by these famous architects. Like Le Corbusier is known for having sort of experimented with the golden ratio, or the golden mean, it's also called. But it can be found in natural structures like the shells of certain mollusks, and it's very mysterious. It's also intimately related with another important mathematical set of quantities, the Fibonacci sequence. And so this person is asking, like, how would you approach this fact, the fact that it seems to repeat itself in music and math and everywhere, from a theological perspective? And I actually do kind of have an answer to this that is related both to the Christmas episode and the stuff that I've been saying about Plato's Timaeus. If you've been listening to me talk about Plato's Timaeus, which is this sort of sequel to the Republic, it's this big vision of the cosmos according to which reason is built into the structure of all creation and also into the structure of the human person, and not just our physical bodies, although those also express a certain kind of proportion, but also to the way that our soul is structured. And so the reason that we're able to intuit, reason, and do math, right, which math is this crazy thing where our brains are structured to like understand things about the world in a very like abstract way that then plays out in the rest of the world, is basically a function for Plato of the fact that we are constructed in this kind of miniature way, in the same way, according to the same rules of logic and math, that the whole universe is. That is why math is not just like a fun puzzle to do in your head. It's actually this sort of abstract way of encapsulating the way that the whole world is structured and the way that we respond to things, like music. Music isn't just pretty sounds. It's sound waves that correspond to brain waves and can do remarkable things with people who are like in comas. You know, there's all sorts of scientific research on this. And Plato relates this in the Timaeus, but also in the Laws, to our sort of human impulse to make rhythmic motions and harmonious noise, right? All this stuff is very baked very deep into us. And so I would argue from a classical perspective, the golden ratio therefore makes perfect sense. The fact that there exists this certain proportion, this kind of elegant proportion that can be applied in all these different ways, well, it's because that's just mapping the structure of the whole universe into all of these spheres of human endeavor. From a theological perspective, right, this is basically echoed to some degree in John. In John 1, I've talked about this before, which has this kind of semi-stoic outlook on creation, that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then through the Word, all things that were made, and nothing was made without this second person of the Trinity, which would become incarnate in Jesus Christ. Now, that means that this one person, right, which is at the heart of everything, is mapped out onto all of creation. And so it totally stands to reason that, you know, just as this is something that seems mystical, but it's actually not. If you think about like actual people that you know in the world, right, like Bob or Dan or your dad or your best friend, right, like those people are not just able to be expressed in their physical presence. You can also find those people expressed in letters. You can read a letter and know that it's from that person. You can find the same pattern of character and the same essence of a certain person in a video that they made or a painting or whatever. There are a million different ways that one human soul can be kind of re-expressed. The same human soul can be re-expressed again and again in all these different forms. That's what creation is. And that is why something like the golden ratio, which kind of boils down to a pure mathematical abstraction, things that we find in every place, right? That's why that is. It's because, in fact, the same character, the same essence, the same person is being expressed in all these different infinitely creative ways all throughout the entire universe, which is pretty cool if you think about it. So this is a great one. He did write out, this next person review, wrote out Socrates ton Klavan, which is a sort of transliteration / translation of Save the Klavan. I think it's very, very funny. Okay. This is a really interesting question, and I hope that answering it will equip some people to talk to some people. I am a Catholic, and my wife is a Jehovah's Witness. Just a few days ago, we had a disagreement about John 1:1 and the divine identity of Jesus. So it was just talking about the Gospel of John, right? The opening, the Word was with God, the Word was God. The Jehovah's Witnesses argue that the correct translation for this verse is, in the beginning, the Word was with God, and the Word was a God, since the second occurrence of the term God is missing a definite article in the original Greek. This is great. I do have an answer to this. So, since the second occurrence of the term God is missing a definite article in the original Greek. A definite article, for those who don't know, is the, right? In English, the, which is different from an indefinite article like any one of a or an, right? Like a clock versus the clock on the wall, right? So the is the definite article. Could you explain why Jesus is necessarily the incarnation of God and not some holy creature? The question is all the more important during the Christmas season. Thank you all. So this is a question about the Greek of John 1, right? The first verse of the first chapter, which I've just quoted in English, but here it is in Greek, right? In arche ein hologos, kai hologos ein pros ton theon, kai theos ein hologos. So the Jehovah's Witness interpretation is essentially that the middle clause, hologos ein pros ton theon, has a definite article. The Word was with literally the God, meaning like the one God, God alone. And then the next one doesn't have a definite article, kai theos ein ho logos. And so the Jehovah's Witness translation would be something like, and the word was divine, or the word was sacred, or something along those lines. This, to me, is not a good argument. And I'm going to sort of say a couple reasons why. Here's the truth of it. The true part is that in the Bible, many things are called God that are not the real God. For example, routinely in Hebrew, angels and false gods are called Elohim. And in fact, in Psalm 8, I'm quoting this off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. In Psalm 8, it said that God has made man, in the translation, it often says a little lower than the angels. But the Hebrew is me'at me Elohim, a little bit less than gods. You have made us a little bit less than gods. And so there is an awareness in Scripture of rival gods to God. And it's the part of the purpose of Scripture to show that those gods are actually not God at all. There is, however, unfortunately, in Greek, a phrase for saying a God that is not God, and it's theos tis, a certain God, one God among many. And this is all over the New Testament. Mark 14, Luke 8, Luke 1, Luke 11. You can find it everywhere, right? And tis is this kind of, it's an indefinite some God or another. And so if that had been the intention of John, that was readily available to him. And in general, when there are linguistic resources available to say something a certain way, and the author doesn't, it's not really good argument to claim that he's just doing it anyway. It's not as if, what I'm not going to claim to you is that this one verse taken alone couldn't possibly mean what the Jehovah's Witnesses say. I think it's a stretch. I think it's the by far the less likely reading of the Greek. But, I think Christians draw from a whole range of sources, such as Jesus' own statements about himself, to also demonstrate that the proper interpretation here is that the Word was God. The idea that Jesus was kind of a blessed or divine person is something called Arianism, right? It's a long-standing idea. The other thing about this, though, is that in the structure of Greek sentences, you have, basically speaking, you have a subject and a predicate, and the subject is the thing that is the subject of the sentence, such as in this case, the word, right? And then the predicate is like what the thing is or what it's doing. And so in this case, ein theos was God is the predicate, and the subject is hologos. When the predicate comes before the subject, as it does here, it's normal Greek practice not to have a definite article. So it's actually unremarkable and not really a feature of the thing that requires like some other explanation than that. That's why in my view, the Jehovah's Witness argument doesn't hold up here. And I hope that I haven't caused marital distress or strife between you and your wife. Okay, next one. Have you actually learned Old English? And if so, how? How many languages have you learned? Just curious. I am learning Old English very, very slowly. I'm enjoying it very much. I don't have a ton of time to really sit down and drill it. But I'm getting there. I mean, I'm reading Beowulf and sort of plodding my way through it. How many languages have I learned? So it's tricky because like some languages I can read quite well, but not really speak. And some languages I can speak and read, and it's sort of like, I've picked some up and forgotten them. But I would say that broadly speaking, I am proficient in Hebrew, Latin, Greek, French, German, and I'm forgetting one as well. Well, English, obviously. And then there's, and Arabic. I forgot to mention classical Arabic, which I do read. So that's 7 that I would feel comfortable with. And then I've like dabbled in others, like Old English, for example. Once you know one Romance language, it becomes much, much easier to learn the other ones. So that's like a help. And if you're trying to do it, I would suggest starting with Latin or Greek, and then you'll have the door open to just the sort of way these things tend to work, if you see what I mean. All right. So here's the next one. What do you think is C.S. Lewis's greatest work of fiction. That's right. So I've said before that I'm like not the best person to talk about C.S. Lewis fiction, because I just like I'm so enamored of his nonfiction, and I'm so much like on the train of pressing it. I will say that Out of the Silent Planet has some of my favorite passages, and I quote. There's a passage from it about meeting somebody and then remembering the meeting afterward that I quote all the time in the Lewis episode and elsewhere. So I guess that's my favorite. I mean, his greatest might be Narnia. I mean, greatest in the sense of like having, really kind of gotten at something essential about the experience of faith in the interwar, and even during World War II in Britain, and he was grasping at something that he would spend his whole career really trying to manage and talk about. So that may be his greatest work, but I would say Out of the Silent Planet is probably my personal favorite. Okay. Hi, Spencer. A mailbag question. How can I find truly edifying friendships? At 18 years old right now, I feel like the friendships I've had have been lacking true depth and a certain fellowship I desire. It seems to me that most kids today prioritize indulgence, and thus it's the most common way of initiating and maintaining friendships. The partying lifestyle just isn't for me, though. I've always longed for the type of friends that I could sit around a fire with and discuss thought-provoking things with smoking jackets and scotch in hand. How can I form friendships like that of the Inklings or even the guys at the Daily Wire? Yeah. So I'm going to spend a little time on this one because it's so important. It's particularly, it's not that it's more important for men to have friends than for women to have friends, but I think men, in part of the assault on masculinity has been a sort of attack on the different ways in which men tend to pursue friendships. And either, like, the fact that we sexualize everything means that, like, intimate male friendships are often sort of slurred as being gay. And then the other thing is that, like, the ways in which men bond, which often don't have to do, initially at least, with like sharing a lot of emotions, but rather with doing things together. Those are sort of looked down upon by contemporary like therapeutic culture. So I would like to, and friendship is so urgently essential to life that this is something that is really starving a lot of people. You're not alone in this, and you're not alone in this problem. It's something that I am somebody who has a very small circle of really committed friends, whom I like really love dearly, and who intimately shape the way that I think and write and just live in the world. I'm not somebody who has like a ton of friends, although I have many people with whom I am friendly and many wonderful acquaintances whom I love to hang out with. But this kind of friendship is actually a virtue. In the Aristotelian sense, it is an excellence of what it is to be human. And so I want to start with Aristotle to think about this. And this is in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 8. And he says, friendship is a virtue or implies virtue, and it is besides most necessary with a view to living. For without friends, no one would choose to live, though he had all other goods. Even rich men and those in possession of office and of dominating power are thought to need friends most of all. For what is the use of such prosperity without the opportunity of beneficence, which is exercised chiefly and in its most laudable form toward friends? Or how can prosperity be guarded and preserved without friends? The greater it is, the more exposed it is to risk. So he says, this is a virtue. It's an excellence of life. And Lewis says elsewhere, in an essay that is really good and kind of cribs from some of this stuff in Aristotle that I would recommend. It's called The Inner Ring. It's in The Weight of Glory, which is that collection. So I would suggest reading that as well. But he later says, Lewis says that that it accounts for almost half the happiness in the world or something. And we've kind of lost it because we think about it as a side dish or something that we do in our spare time as opposed to like an essential part of what it is to live. Aristotle says, not everything seems to be loved, but only the lovable. And this is the good, the pleasant, and the useful. And so he divides friendship into three kinds, the kind that is good, the kind that's pleasant, the kind that's useful. Because these reasons differ from each other in kind, so therefore do the corresponding forms of love and friendship. There are therefore three kinds of friendship, equal in number to the things that are lovable. For with respect to each there is a mutual and recognized love, and those who love each other wish well to each other in that respect in which they love one another. Now those who love each other for their utility do not love each other for themselves, but in virtue of some good which they get from each other. So this is like, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. These sort of professional friendships that he says are, sort of a lower form of friendship. So too with those who love for the sake of pleasure. It is not for their character that men love ready-witted people, but because they find them pleasant. So you've got a funny friend or whatever that you find funny, that's a sort of more superficial form of friendship. Therefore, those who love for the sake of utility love for the sake of what is good for themselves, and those who love for the sake of pleasure do so for the sake of what is pleasant to themselves, and not insofar as the other person is the person loved, but insofar as he is useful or pleasant. And thus these friendships are only incidental, for it is not as being the man he is that the loved person is loved, but as providing some good or pleasure. Such friendships then are easily dissolved if the parties do not remain like themselves, for if the one party is no longer pleasant or useful, the other ceases to love him. So this is the crucial distinction, right? So what's left after utility and pleasure? And pleasure, by the way, is the kind of friendships that you're describing your peers seeking, right? That you're seeking, they're seeking these kind of pleasure-based friendships about partying and laughing together. And you're right that those are not the kind of friendships that count as the true, gifts of life. Well, what's left? It is the friendship for what is good and admiration of nobility and goodness in another person for the sake of the other person. And men find this through pursuit of a common good, right? That when you meet somebody who responds to something that you also respond to as excellent, whether it's art or like a sport or something that just like absolutely whatever, you need to find in your own self what it is that answers that like emptiness in you, that there's something calling out in you to seek the good and the true and the beautiful. And you need to seek that for your own self so that you can recognize when other people are also seeking it. And then you can begin to seek it together. This is why I recommend like seeking friends at church, for example, like seeking friends in places where the people are going to be doing the thing that they find lovely and good, that you also find lovely and good. It's rare. It takes a long time. It takes cultivation, and you shouldn't be discouraged if you don't immediately have this all around, right? I've been very, very blessed with some really wonderful friends. The last thing to remember, right, is that because you find true friends in seeking the good, what you really are doing is you're finding fellow travelers on the path to God, on the search to please God, and as a result of that, God will find you your friends. And this is something, if you trust God and if you seek God first, God will lead you into the path of those who know how to encourage you in that search, who know how to check you, and as the Bible says, iron sharpens iron, right? So you will know how to engage together over the things that you love. So seek first the things that you love, and then seek those who can really challenge you and guide you and lead you in those things by turns. And this is another bit from Lewis that I want to quote about the fact that you actually kind of don't pick your friend. Everyone says nowadays, right, you don't pick your family, but you pick your friends. This is kind of wrong. You fall in love with your friends. And that's a funny thing to say, because when you say fall in love, you immediately think with romantic love. But of course, the Greeks knew there are many kinds of love. Not all of them are erotic, not all of them are sexual, but they all have this quality that they actually have to do with our own hearts and yearnings, over which we don't have as much choice as we like to think. And so allowing your search for the good to lead you into falling in love with a friend, of falling into friendship, right? Falling into this kind of love. And Lewis is cautioning, and he has this book, The Four Loves, in which one of his sections is about friendship. And he cautions against the illusion that you have found your friends purely on your own steam. He says, it may seem to us that we 4 or 5 have chosen one another, the insight of each finding the intrinsic beauty of the rest, like to like, of voluntary nobility, that we have ascended above the rest of mankind by our native powers. The other loves do not invite the same illusion. Affection obviously requires kinships, or at least proximities, which never depended on our own choice. And as for eros, that's romantic love, sexual love. Half the love songs and half the love poems in the world will tell you that the beloved is your fate or destiny, no more your choice than a thunderbolt, for it is not in our power to love or hate. Cupid's archery, genes, anything but ourselves. But in friendship, being free of all that, we think we have chosen our peers. In reality, a few years difference in the dates of our births, a few more miles between certain houses, the choice of one university instead of another, posting to different regiments, the accident of a topic being raised or not raised at a first meeting, any of these choices might have kept us apart. But for a Christian, there are, strictly speaking, no chances. A secret master of the ceremonies has been at work. Christ, who said to the disciples, "Ye have not chosen me, but I have chosen you," can truly say to every group of Christian friends, "You have not chosen one another, but I have chosen you for one another." The friendship is not a reward for our discrimination and good taste in finding one another out. It is the instrument by which God reveals to each the beauties of all the others. They are no greater than the beauties of 1,000 other men. By friendship, God opens our eyes to them. They are, like all beauties, derived from him, and then, in a good friendship, increased by him through the friendship itself, so that it is his instrument for creating as well as for revealing. At this feast, it is he who has spread the board, and it is he who has chosen the guest. It is he, we may dare to hope, who sometimes does, and always should, preside. Let us not reckon without our host. So, seek the good toward which you are called, and you will find in the pursuit of that and in gathering with those who pursue it, that you make the kinds of friends that you want to make. It may be that because you are trying to make friends, you're seeking the friend-making events. That's entirely wrong. Friend-making events, I agree, especially in modern youth culture, are totally vapid, mostly based on pleasure or utility. Don't seek that. Seek the excellent events and find in them the people that will become your lifelong friends. Good luck. Let me know how it goes. Hi, Spencer. I attended a few Presbyterian Zoom services just to see. I am Catholic by baptism, though not much by practice. I was reading about Presbyterian versus Catholic. The subject of cults was another article. Just curious if you think of the left as a cult. I see parallels and wonder if it is. Not sure who the leader is either, if not naming one is part of the plan. Curious your perspective as you are a Christian and a scholar. Thank you, Paula. Interesting. Okay, so first of all, I hope that you find somewhere that you can be that thing in actual practice. I don't know your whole story, so I don't want to presume that it should be the Catholic Church or that there may be another church out there for you. It may not be the Presbyterian Church. You might consider RCA, Reformed Church of America, but it's not really. That's actually not what the question is about. The question is about whether the left is a cult. And cult is a word that's had a lot of different meanings. It's had the meaning of sort of kooky splinter group led by a weird charismatic, but it's also had the meaning of just a sect. So different forms of religion. And then in its oldest sense, it comes from this Latin idea of cultus and cultivation. And so the cults of different local gods were just cults in the sense of just they were the group of people that sort of cherished and preserved the rights of that god. In that sense, I think that the left is a cult because I think that it is a religion. I think that, as I've argued, I think in the localism episode, I argued that these forms of hero worship that emerge and these forms of purity culture, having to recite the creed of BLM on your knees, are basically just humans doing what humans do, which is worship whatever they think is the highest good, and develop a series of practices and enforcement techniques around that. And so I think that having really kind of cut God out of a lot of our social practices, we are developing a form of cultism around, especially radical leftism. It's very sad to see because, of course, it can't sustain. That's not actually, it's not true that that's the highest or best thing in the world, and it leads people down the path to madness. So that is sort of why I would suggest, finding a way of going about your week that recognizes a different highest power than the power of the state, which is basically the cult or just the religion of the left. I'm going to pause now before I do the next question and just say like, I'm having so much fun. I'm so glad you guys are here with me doing this. Thank you for these amazing questions, these comments, these responses. There are some ways that you concretely can help keep this going and support this show. It's a really dangerous time for people who make media like this. And this show is fledgling and young and just getting off the ground. And so I would love if you could help us. There are a few ways you can do that. If you haven't already subscribed, do subscribe wherever you are. iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, whatever. You can also find our community on Locals, where we'll be doing exactly this, just hanging out, talking about your questions, hopefully getting some guidance for your personal life, as I said earlier, like what's the point of this for you? And I'll be doing all sorts of extra things on there. You can get episodes early, and you can support this show financially by becoming a subscriber. So head over to locals.com. It's Young Heretics, or just search for Spencer Klavan and leave a 5-star review, even though this is the last time you can ask a question in the 5-star review. You can still ask questions through the normal channels, and you can certainly ask them on Locals if you like. Thanks for being here. Let's do it. Let's do a little bit more. What do you think of your father's fiction? I'm a fan of his podcasts and just read Another Kingdom, which I really enjoyed. How has his artistic vision influenced you? I have thought about the fact that if my father were not my father, I would want to do a Young Heretics episode on his novels. And I feel a little bit like I don't have a good leg to stand on saying that this is going to be one of the enduring cultural products of the West, because he's my dad and I'm like so not unbiased. But I will say that there are a few ways that, at least let's put it this way, there are a few ways that my father's artistic approach has really been formative for me. Besides the fact that my father is one of the, remember I was talking about like dear, close, intimate friends. Like my father is one of them. In addition to being my dad, like we go on hikes a lot. We really have conversations that I think influence us both very profoundly, and that then come up in our respective work and our writings. And so, it's really, if anything, it's our relationship that's most influenced me. But my dad's fiction is genre fiction, and this is something that I think people don't really know what that means anymore. But it means that there's a convention to the form, just like there is to a sonnet. In a sonnet you have 14 lines, and they're different types, but there's a certain rhyme scheme, ABAB or ABBA or whatever. Detective fiction, hard-boiled detective fiction, just like Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, whom we've talked about, like there are certain conventions, and I think that my father is engaging with those in a literary way, and even in a kind of supernaturalist and Christian way now in his later career, which is profoundly influential for my attitude about pop culture. That it's because I believe that pop culture has the potential to actually be art, like to genuinely do those things I talked about in the episode on art, to instruct, to move, to delight. It's because I believe those things that I kind of am dismissive of a lot of pop culture, because I think it's falling down on that job. And I think that one of the things my dad has done throughout his career is to elevate detective fiction to the level and the space of the great novels. That is, the ones that engage with big ideas and that sort of create this sort of rip-roaring fun while framing it against a backdrop of massive questions worked out in the real lives of actual people. I would recommend Werewolf Cop very much for this. It is kind of his most supernatural and Christian detective novel, I would say. And it moved me very much. I read it when I was just starting out in grad school, right before it came out in the press. And I think it's kind of pointing the way toward a very American, very gritty and gory, but also very real and edifying vision of the world that is Christianized and is mythic. So yeah, I would recommend that. There's a lot of ones. I'd recommend True Crime and Don't Say a Word and so forth. But that's a little bit about when if you go back and watch or listen to, if you haven't already, the Dashiell Hammett episode on the Maltese Falcon. That's probably where the influence of my dad is most apparent. The fact that I feel like I want to do that. The fact that I'm talking about video games and pop culture as if it has the potential to be real art. That's I think from my dad. Any suggestions of what we should read about reading in order to better read well. So this is interesting. I think you mentioned in this question that you've read C.S. Lewis's Experiment in Criticism, which is the first thing I would have said. And you've also read the other one that I was going to say, How to Read Literature Like a Professor by Thomas Foster. These are good. They're really nice. And then C.S. Lewis's preface to Paradise Lost is another really good one if you haven't read that. I find this hard because I have advice to give about reading, especially one advice that I have is to treat books like your companions rather than your tasks. Like, oh, I have to get through this book and then be done with it. You need to understand that these things are going to be with you your whole life, and that you may not really immediately sort of grasp what they're about. You may need to come back to them. And so thinking of books as friends that you are meeting in the same way that you meet a person the first time, and you might be like, oh, that guy's kind of weird, or like, that guy's kind of interesting. And then you spend more time with them, and you're like, wow, this person actually has really interesting things to say. Treat books as your friends. But there are some surveys that are good. I've recommended From Dawn to Decadence before by Jacques Barzun, although apparently it's pronounced Barzun. I didn't know this, but Barzun. That's a really wonderful sort of survey of the last 500 years or so. And a few other, Harold Bloom is pretty good for this. Some of Harold Bloom's work. But really, I actually think that just getting your hands on a good copy of the Bible, of the complete works of Shakespeare, of the Aeneid, and something from American lit, like The Great Gatsby or East of Eden, and sort of working your way through those and making sure you read the introduction so that you understand what this person is doing and what the point of this book is. That's actually probably a better way to get in, is just to dip your toes in a little bit. And having read the things that you cite, I think you'll have a leg up. But I really think that you've got to sort of taste and see, as the Christians say, and the struggling through it is you're not going to eliminate the struggle. I certainly never have eliminated the struggle of meeting a new author for the first time, and of course you get practice at it and you learn to do it better. But I would suggest spending your time on reading rather than trying to plan techniques for reading. You learn by doing. All right, that's it for this special all mailbag edition of Young Heretics. I know I didn't get to all your questions, but I hope that the answers were satisfying for those of you that I did. If you want more opportunities to have these kinds of conversations with me, which I love having, a great way to do that is to get on Locals. So that's youngheretics.com/locals. You'll see episodes in advance. You can ask me questions on the video mailbag, where you'll actually be on the show as part of the video. And then we'll do all sorts of exclusive stuff like live stream Q&As and more ways for us to connect there. So this has been Young Heretics. You can go now to youngheretics.com/locals. It's $4.99 a month for a limited time. And you can become a Young Heretics VIP. So if you like this show, as I always say, you will love the stuff that I do and that we do at the Claremont Institute where I work. We put out the Claremont Review of Books, which is a literary magazine, and we put out The American Mind, which is online. So that's claremont.org/donate if you want to know how to support us. And we will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.